Sandra Okafor arrived at the hospital at 6:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before her shift began. She did this every day, not because the hospital required it, not because anyone noticed. She arrived early because there was always something that needed doing. A crash cart that had been restocked incorrectly, a drip that was running slightly too fast, a patient in Bay 3 who had not been repositioned in 4 hours, and whose silence was being mistaken for comfort. She moved through the emergency room the way experienced people move through familiar spaces, efficiently, without performance. She checked the supply drawers, adjusted 2 fluid lines, spoke quietly to a night shift nurse who looked like she hadn't sat down in 6 hours, and then tied her hair back and prepared for the morning. The hospital was a large one, in a mid-sized coastal city, and the emergency room was busy in the way coastal city emergency rooms tend to be, a steady, unpredictable mix of the urgent and the serious and the heartbreaking. Sandra had worked here for 4 years. Before that, she had worked at a different hospital, in a different state. Before that, she had not worked in a hospital at all. But that was not something most people here knew. She was 38 years old. She was not loud. She did not tell stories about herself at the nurses' station. She laughed when things were funny, helped when things were hard, and went home at the end of her shift to a small house with a garden she maintained with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. Her colleagues liked her, most of them anyway. Dr. Callahan did not dislike her exactly. He simply did not think very much about her. She was a nurse. He was an attending physician with 12 years of practice and a way of standing in rooms that suggested he was the most important element in them. He was not a cruel man. He was, in the way that certain successful people sometimes are, simply careless about the space he took up and the weight his words carried when they landed on people he had not bothered to truly see. That morning, around 9 o'clock, he said something to his resident, while Sandra was 2 feet away, restocking a medication tray. It was about overtime pay. It became, without much effort on his part, a comment about whether nurses actually thought through what they were doing or simply followed instructions the way a well-trained dog follows commands. His resident laughed. The second resident laughed a half-second later, checking first that the first one had laughed. Sandra did not look up from the tray. She finished restocking it, carried it to where it belonged, and moved on. She had a policy, built over many years and a few different lifetimes, about where she spent her energy. Responding to men like Callahan was not on the list. The morning moved the way mornings in emergency rooms move, in waves, each one arriving before the previous one had fully receded. A 7-year-old with a seizure that had stopped by the time the ambulance arrived, but whose cause still needed finding. A construction worker, 53 years old, with a piece of rebar through his right thigh, stable, terrified, trying very hard not to look at his own leg. A grandmother with chest pain, whose 4 adult children were in the waiting room, asking the same questions in rotating order and expecting different answers each time. Sandra worked all 3 cases in the way she worked everything, attentively, calmly, without calling attention to the attention she was paying. On the construction worker's case, she noticed something. His lips were pale in a way that was slightly beyond what his current blood pressure explained. She adjusted his fluid rate without making it a discussion, without pulling anyone aside, without writing a note about her reasoning. She simply adjusted it, watched him for 10 minutes, and then moved on when his color began to come back. When the case concluded and the man was stable and ready for surgery, Dr. Callahan entered a note about his own management of the fluid balance. Sandra read the note later and felt nothing in particular about it. This was also not new. At 11:22, the charge desk radio came to life with a kind of urgency that changed the air pressure in the room. Mass casualty event. A training exercise at the Naval Special Warfare Compound 40 minutes south had produced injuries, not combat, but serious. 15 personnel. The injuries ranged from moderate to critical. They were coming here because here was the closest Level 1 trauma center. The emergency room did what emergency rooms do when the radio delivers this kind of news. It transformed. The quiet morning reorganized itself into a different kind of silence. Focused, quick, purposeful. Beds were cleared. Teams were assembled. The charge nurse began calling assignments. Sandra was already at Bay 7. She had not waited to be assigned. She had looked at the incoming information, the nature of the casualties, the estimated arrivals, the injury patterns described in the initial report, and she had gone to Bay 7 because Bay 7 was where the most critical patient would need to go, and she had started pulling equipment. Not guessing at what she would need, knowing. She pulled it by sequence, by category, in an order that the other nurses, watching her from across the room, could not quite follow, but did not question, because her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had done this, not in training simulations, but in actual circumstances, where the difference between the right sequence and the wrong one was not a point on an evaluation, but something else entirely. Nobody asked her how she knew what she knew. Nobody had ever asked. The ambulances began arriving at 11:51. The men inside them were large. Several of them were very large. They were the particular kind of quiet that you recognize, if you have been around it, as trained quiet. Not the quiet of shock or passivity, but the quiet of people who have learned to manage pain by organizing it, by putting it somewhere temporarily, and dealing with the more pressing situation first. They did not complain. They answered questions directly and completely, and then stopped talking. Several of them, even while being treated, were watching the room with the kind of eyes that do not stop gathering information, regardless of what the rest of the body is doing. Sandra moved between bays, she assessed, she communicated, she did not waste words. The last ambulance arrived at 12:19. The man inside it was the reason they had called ahead. His vitals were unstable in 3 different ways, which is not the same as being unstable in one way 3 times over. It requires a different kind of thinking, the kind that holds several problems simultaneously, without letting the urgency of one cause you to lose track of the others. He was unconscious. His rank insignia, partially visible at the collar of his uniform, was the rank of a senior non-commissioned officer in the Naval Special Warfare community. Sandra looked at him for approximately 2 seconds. Then she moved to the head of the gurney. No one had assigned her to this patient. No one had told her to take the lead. She simply moved to the head of the gurney, and her hands were already where they needed to be, and she had already begun calling for what she needed. Not loudly, not urgently, but in the tone of someone who expects to be heard and responded to, and is not wrong about that expectation. The room responded to her. This is a hard thing to describe. It was not that she took command in any visible, dramatic way. She did not announce anything. She did not look around the room to establish her authority. She simply began working, and the people around her began organizing themselves in relation to what she was doing, the way a river organizes itself around a rock, not because the rock demands it, but because the shape of things makes it inevitable. Dr. Callahan stood near the edge of the bay. For the first time that morning, he was not the center of a room. He watched Sandra Okafor work. She called for intubation equipment. She got it. She called for specific medication doses, in a specific sequence, with timing instructions that she delivered in the same tone you would use to tell someone what time the bus arrives. She identified the most dangerous of the 3 unstable variables and addressed it first, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the one that would foreclose all the other options if it was not managed immediately. She was right. The patient's oxygen saturation began climbing, slowly, then more steadily. His blood pressure found a floor and stopped falling. His heart rhythm, which had been doing something uncertain, resolved into something that was not perfect, but was workable and getting better. 18 minutes after the gurney had come through the doors, the patient was stable. The room exhaled. Sandra stepped back from the gurney. She checked the monitors once more. She spoke briefly to the ICU team that was preparing to receive him. She answered 2 questions from a resident, without looking up from the chart she was reviewing, and then the double doors at the far end of the trauma bay opened. 14 men walked in. They were in uniform. Full dress. They had received word that their commanding officer was in critical condition, and they had driven from the compound without waiting for official authorization to do so, because this was not the kind of thing they waited for official authorization for. They came through the door quickly, the way people move when they are afraid and are not willing to let the fear slow them down. And then they saw Sandra Okafor. She was standing at the head of the gurney. Her back was straight. She was reading something on the chart with the particular focus of someone who does not know that 14 people have just walked into the room behind her. There was a pause. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In a quiet room, 3 seconds is a noticeable amount of time. The man at the front of the group, tall, broad, with a face that looked like it had been present for a significant number of things, stopped walking. He looked at Sandra. Something in his expression shifted. He came to attention. Behind him, like dominoes, one by one, and then all at once, the other 13 men did the same. 14 Navy SEALs standing at attention in a hospital trauma bay is not something the emergency room staff had encountered before. It is the kind of image that you remember, later, with a clarity that most ordinary moments do not produce. Sandra heard the sound of the room change. She looked up from the chart. The man at the front, the senior man, the one who had come to attention first, stepped forward. "Chief Petty Officer Okafor," he said. "Not Nurse Okafor. Chief." Sandra looked at him. She recognized him. He recognized that she recognized him. The room, which was not part of this recognition, stood very still in the way that rooms do when something is happening that they do not fully understand, but can feel the weight of. "Commander Ellis," Sandra said. It was not a question. It came out the way these things always come out, not as an announcement, not as a revelation delivered in a single moment, but as a series of small facts, surfacing one after another, the way objects surface after a flood. 12 years. United States Navy. Special Operations Combat Medic. Assigned to Naval Special Warfare for the last 7 of those 12 years. 3 combat deployments. Injuries sustained in the course of the 3rd deployment. A knee rebuilt twice. And when the 3rd option was a desk in Virginia or discharge, she had taken the discharge without much hesitation. A commendation that lived in the bottom drawer of her bedside table, in the envelope it had arrived in, which she had not opened in front of anyone. She had become a nurse, because it was the closest available thing to what she had always done. Because the work was real, and the need was constant, and she was good at it, in the way she was good at everything she had ever applied herself to. Not through talent exactly, but through a particular quality of attention that she had carried since childhood, and that the military had refined into something very precise. She had not told anyone in this hospital any of this. Not because she was hiding it, because no one had asked, and because, in her experience, the work either spoke for itself or it didn't, and adding biography to it didn't change what it was. Dr. Callahan stood against the wall with a paper coffee cup in his hand that he had forgotten he was holding. He was looking at Sandra Okafor the way people sometimes look at a familiar painting when they suddenly understand what it is actually depicting. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and he seemed to understand this, which was possibly the most intelligent thing he had managed all day. At the end of the shift, Sandra changed out of her scrubs in the locker room. She opened her locker. On the inside of the door, held there by a single piece of tape, was a photograph. She was younger in it, leaner. Her shoulders were squared in the particular way that years of a particular kind of life produce. Not posed, not performed. Just the natural posture of someone who had carried serious things, and whose body remembered. Behind her in the photograph was a landscape that was all sky and dust, and the particular quality of light that belongs to places very far from anywhere comfortable. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Not with nostalgia exactly, the way you look at something that is simply true. She closed the locker. She walked through the corridor, past the nurses' station where 2 of the day shift nurses were talking about what had happened, past the bay where the commander was resting with a monitor showing steady, reliable numbers, past the place where Dr. Callahan's office door was closed. She pushed through the exit and stepped into the evening air. The parking lot was ordinary. The sky was the color it gets just after the sun finishes setting, but before the dark arrives properly. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm was doing what car alarms do. Sandra walked to her car, got in, set her bag on the passenger seat, and pulled out of the lot. She was on shift again tomorrow at 6:47. She would arrive at 6:34.